As he grew, Nick's relationship with his parents became increasingly complicated. On one hand, there was love and guidance. On the other, there was a subtle hierarchy that consistently reinforced his place at the periphery. Nick sought approval, attempted to align with his parents' expectations, and tried to find his niche within a household that, in public, appeared cohesive and loving. Yet the emotional distance persisted. Small slights, forgotten responsibilities, and uneven attention created a quiet tension that Nick internalized. He may have smiled, joked, or complied, but inside, a sense of exclusion grew steadily, unnoticed by outsiders. School years can be formative in understanding a child's sense of belonging, and Nick's experiences were no exception. Attending prestigious schools, mingling with the children of Hollywood elites, he was surrounded by peers who had family legacies, connections, and influence. In this context, the Reiners' wealth was both protective and isolating. Nick had material access to the world many dreamed of, yet social and emotional inclusion remained elusive. Achievements he considered significant may have been met with mild acknowledgement, while successes of his sisters were celebrated. These repeated comparisons, whether intentional or unconscious, shaped the lens through which Nick viewed his worth within the family structure. It is important to recognize that family dynamics are rarely linear or simple. Nick's feelings of exclusion did not imply a lack of love. They reflected complexity. Parents can love a child deeply yet favor another, often unintentionally, for reasons as simple as personality alignment, gender, or shared interests. In Nick's case, he reportedly observed an ongoing pattern of attention directed toward Romy and Tracy, further entrenching his perception of being marginalized. The sense of invisible son became a psychological framework that colored every interaction he had with his parents. By the time Nick reached adolescence, these dynamics had evolved into tension. Adolescence is a period where identity and self-worth are intimately connected to family validation. Feeling excluded or ignored can foster resentment, rebellion, or withdrawal. Nick's trajectory, however, was marked by loyalty and compliance, even as internal frustrations mounted. Friends and insiders recall that he often kept his discontent private, internalizing the perception of injustice rather than vocalizing it openly. This quiet accumulation of resentment, invisible to many, became a critical factor in the eventual escalation that would follow. At the same time, Nick developed a deep awareness of the family hierarchy. He could see who was valued, whose opinions mattered, and whose presence was celebrated. Romy and Tracy, in their public-facing roles, seemed to embody the success, attention, and affection that Nick craved. The disparity between his effort and recognition, between his loyalty and acknowledgement, created a fertile ground for emotional tension. This is the type of dynamic that psychologists identify as high risk for future conflicts, especially when compounded by sudden, emotionally charged triggers, like a change in the will. Beyond the emotional landscape, Nick's physical environment reinforced these dynamics. Living in the guest house on the Reiner estate separated him from the main household, both literally and symbolically. Proximity did not equal inclusion. Meals, conversations, decision-making, and social rituals often happened in spaces where Nick was peripheral. The guest house became a metaphor for his place in the family, close enough to observe, but distant enough to be ignored. Every day spent in that separation was a reminder of his outsider status, even within his own family. Yet, Nick's experience was not solely negative. There were moments of genuine familial bonding, vacations, celebrations, milestones. These moments, however, were often punctuated by reminders of exclusion. It is this oscillation between inclusion and neglect that can intensify emotional turmoil. The intermittent reinforcement, sometimes praised, sometimes ignored, creates a pattern where attachment, resentment, and confusion are entangled, making it harder for the individual to reconcile their emotions. In retrospect, we can see the pattern that shaped Nick's worldview. Childhood experiences, early adolescence, and the ongoing negotiation of attention and validation created an underlying tension. This tension, though invisible to outsiders, became a central feature of his identity. Feeling perpetually marginalized, Nick carried with him a sense of grievance that simmered quietly beneath the surface. The psychological impact of these years is not trivial. Decades of perceived slight, combined with moments of public visibility for his siblings, established the emotional groundwork that would later intersect with a tangible act of perceived betrayal, the will. To understand what happened next, it is crucial to recognize that this story is not simply about wealth or fame. It is about the human psyche, about how repeated patterns of perceived exclusion and favoritism can accumulate over time. Nick's childhood and formative years provide essential context for understanding the gravity of what he claims to have felt when he discovered he had been removed from his parents' estate. That single legal act, when viewed through the lens of a lifetime of perceived marginalization, became more than a financial decision. It became a confirmation of everything he had feared about his place in the family. And yet, there were moments of contradiction. Accounts suggest that Nick was not entirely isolated or ignored. He had interactions, responsibilities, and a presence within the household. These contradictory signals, sometimes valued, sometimes sidelined, intensified the internal conflict. This oscillation between recognition and neglect created a psychological strain that cannot be overstated. The mind seeks consistency, but when experiences are fragmented and conflicting, frustration and confusion can escalate into anger. The culmination of these childhood and adolescent experiences sets the stage for the tragedy that unfolded in December. By the time Nick reached adulthood, he was emotionally primed to respond intensely to perceived betrayal. The discovery of the will, a legally routine event for any family, intersected with a lifetime of feeling marginalized. The convergence of long-standing grievances, immediate triggers, and access to the family's private spaces created the conditions for catastrophe. What makes this story particularly compelling and deeply tragic is that these dynamics were entirely preventable. Communication, acknowledgement, and inclusion could have mitigated decades of tension. Small acts of recognition, validation, and emotional presence might have altered the trajectory of Nick's experiences, potentially preventing the devastating events that followed. Yet, as is often the case in high-stakes families, appearances mattered more than emotional transparency. As we move forward, we will see how these early experiences with exclusion and marginalization directly influenced Nick's relationships with his parents and siblings. The narrative will explore not only the emotional and psychological factors, but also the concrete decisions, interactions, and triggers that led to the fateful weekend in December. Understanding Nick's childhood is essential to understanding the depth of the perceived betrayal he claims to have experienced. And why, in his mind, the events that followed were the inevitable conclusion of a lifetime of neglect. But what came next would escalate the tension in ways no one could have predicted. And it all began with the sisters, Romy and Tracy, quietly holding the family together while Nick felt increasingly invisible. In every family, there are dynamics that are visible and dynamics that are hidden, layers that outsiders rarely see, but which define relationships, loyalties, and conflicts. In the Reiner family, Romy and Tracy occupied a unique position. As the daughters of Rob and Michelle, they were both adored and relied upon, positioned in the center of the family's emotional orbit. They were visible, celebrated, and often treated as the public face of the Reiner household. But being at the center of attention is rarely as simple as it seems. For Romy and Tracy, the spotlight brought both privilege and pressure, and it positioned them in ways that would prove critical in the tragic events that unfolded. Romy, at 27, and Tracy, slightly older, had grown up watching their brother Nick navigate a complicated relationship with their parents. To them, Nick was always present, always part of the family, but sometimes quiet, sometimes withdrawn. From an early age, they may have sensed the subtle tensions, but these were never overtly discussed. In many families, sisters in the middle of attention and parental favor occupy an ambiguous role. They are loved, but they also see the tensions, the slights, and the fractures that others try to hide. For Romy and Tracy, this perspective would later place them in an emotionally complex and deeply traumatic position. The Reiner daughters were accustomed to balancing the dual realities of public expectation and private complexity. They attended social events, were photographed with their parents, and were celebrated for accomplishments both public and personal. Romy, who discovered the bodies of her parents on that fateful Sunday morning, was often positioned as the caretaker of the family's emotional well-being, someone who mediated conflicts and tried to maintain cohesion. Tracy, similarly, was seen as responsible and steady, often acting as a bridge between her siblings and parents. This role of mediator, while emotionally taxing, was ingrained from childhood. Yet, even as the sisters held the family together, underlying tensions with Nick persisted. They were aware, consciously or not, of the feelings of exclusion and resentment that he experienced. Every family has its unspoken rules and hierarchies, and the Reiners were no exception. Romy and Tracy's positions of favor, while not intentionally manipulative, accentuated Nick's perception of marginalization. Small interactions, a conversation that ignored him, a praise directed solely at the daughters, the subtle positioning of attention, reinforced his sense of being sidelined. Over time, these dynamics created invisible barriers, invisible but palpable to those living within them. Romy and Tracy were also directly impacted by the sudden revelation of the will, which, according to Nick, completely excluded him while leaving everything to the daughters. While it might have seemed like a positive outcome for them, the reality was far more complicated. They were placed in a position of both privilege and emotional turmoil. On one hand, they inherited the family estate and its wealth. On the other, they were witnesses to a dramatic escalation of long-standing family tension that would culminate in unimaginable violence. The day of the murders, Romy's role became central in the narrative. She was the one to discover the bodies of her parents, an experience that no one can adequately prepare for. The psychological weight of this moment cannot be overstated. Imagine walking into the home where you were raised, the space you associate with comfort and safety, and finding your parents brutally murdered. In that instant, all the family dynamics, past conflicts, and hidden tensions were amplified. The emotional trauma was compounded by the immediate practical responsibility of notifying law enforcement and providing crucial information about a family member she described as dangerous, implicitly pointing toward Nick. Tracy's experience, though less publicly reported, is equally significant. As a sibling, she had to navigate grief, shock, and the rapid shift from family member to potential inheritor under the most horrific circumstances. Both sisters were suddenly thrust into a complex interplay of emotion, legal scrutiny, and public attention. Every action, word, and decision was scrutinized by authorities, the media, and social networks, creating an environment of intense pressure. Understanding Romy and Tracy's perspectives also sheds light on the intricate dynamics of sibling relationships. Being the favored children does not absolve one from the emotional consequences of family conflict. In fact, it often amplifies them. They witnessed Nick's growing frustration and sense of exclusion, yet they were also positioned as the beneficiaries of the very system he felt betrayed by. This duality, witnesses to grievance and recipients of inheritance, created a tension that would make the events of December 14th even more psychologically complex. Moreover, the sisters' roles illustrate the intersection of public and private pressures in a high-profile family. Their parents' fame and the expectations placed upon the daughters amplified the stakes. They were not only coping with family dynamics, but also with the social implications of their family's public image. Every choice, every reaction, and every public appearance carried weight, shaping perceptions and influencing how the story would be received. Even before the tragic events, the sisters' positions were emotionally precarious. They were expected to maintain harmony, manage appearances, and support their brother, all while navigating their own individual experiences of grief, frustration, and expectation. Romy and Tracy's experiences reflect a broader truth about family dynamics. Those who are perceived as in favor often carry burdens of expectation and responsibility that are invisible to outsiders. The fateful day brought these dynamics into sharp relief. Romy's discovery of the bodies forced immediate action and rapid decision-making under extreme stress. She had to reconcile shock and grief while providing critical information about the potential suspect. Her awareness of the family's internal tensions allowed her to offer context to investigators, but it also placed her in an emotionally vulnerable position. Tracy, similarly, had to contend with both personal loss and the public ramifications of the tragedy. These events underscore the emotional complexity of family hierarchies. Romy and Tracy's centrality within the Reiner family made them both mediators and participants in the unfolding crisis. They had witnessed, perhaps unknowingly, the accumulation of grievances that Nick experienced. Their proximity to the parents, combined with Nick's perceived marginalization, created a situation where long-standing tensions could explode with catastrophic consequences. The sisters' roles also highlight the unpredictability of human behavior within families. Privilege, attention, and perceived favor do not insulate one from tragedy. In fact, they can sometimes intensify emotional volatility in siblings who feel excluded. The Reiner family story is a vivid illustration of how these dynamics, left unaddressed, can escalate into situations that are not only emotionally devastating, but also fatal. As we examine the events leading to December 14th, it is clear that Romy and Tracy's experiences are central to understanding the full scope of the tragedy. Their roles as intermediaries, observers, and beneficiaries intersected with Nick's perception of betrayal in ways that would ultimately culminate in one of the most shocking family crimes in recent history. And yet, even with all of this context, the next chapter reveals a specific catalyst that would push these tensions over the edge: the updated family will. A legal document, seemingly mundane, would act as the trigger that transformed decades of silent resentment into an act of violence that none of the family could have anticipated. But what came next would make the sisters confront a reality far darker than they could have imagined, and it would redefine their understanding of the family they thought they knew. 3 days, 72 hours. That's all it took to shatter a family, to ignite feelings of rage and betrayal that had been quietly simmering for decades. For Nick Reiner, the updated will was not merely a legal document, it was a declaration. It was a final verdict on his place in the family, an explicit confirmation that he had been erased, that his loyalty and love had counted for nothing in the eyes of his parents. And in that moment, the quiet resentments that had been building since childhood surged into something overwhelming, something dangerous. The concept of a will, in most families, is simple: a plan for the distribution of assets after one's death. But in families like the Reiners, wealth is intertwined with legacy, reputation, and identity. Being cut out of such a document carries emotional significance far beyond the financial. For Nick, who had spent years seeking validation and acknowledgement, the updated will was more than just a legal change. It was a personal rejection. It was a signal that, in the eyes of Rob and Michelle, he no longer belonged. Imagine opening a document that had been kept secret, learning that everything he had assumed was rightfully his, money, property, recognition, was now going to his sisters, Romy and Tracy. In any family, such a revelation can sting, but in a household already fraught with tension, it becomes incendiary. Nick reportedly felt a profound sense of erasure, as though the very existence of his contributions, his loyalty, and his presence had been nullified. Every interaction, every sacrifice, every moment he had devoted to the family suddenly seemed invisible. Psychologists note that exclusion from a will can trigger complex emotional responses. It can evoke feelings of betrayal, anger, grief, and shame, all intensified when the excluded individual perceives a lifetime of loyalty ignored. In Nick's case, these feelings were compounded by decades of perceived favoritism toward his sisters, by living physically apart in the guest house, and by the subtle but persistent sense that he was less valued. The timing of the will's update, just 3 days before the murders, added urgency and intensity to these emotions. It was sudden, shocking, and, in his perception, intolerable. But the will itself was not just a symbolic blow. It was a legal and tangible confirmation of what Nick had long feared. He had spent years internalizing feelings of marginalization, questioning his role in the family, and silently grappling with his place relative to Romy and Tracy. The document transformed abstract frustration into concrete reality. It validated every insecurity he had ever felt, and in doing so, created a psychological tipping point. For decades, family interactions had been a complex dance of attention, validation, and expectation. Nick's childhood and adolescence had been shaped by patterns of recognition that were inconsistent at best. While Romy and Tracy were often celebrated and encouraged, Nick's successes were quietly acknowledged or overlooked. The family dynamics created a persistent internal narrative. He was peripheral, his contributions secondary, his presence sometimes tolerated rather than embraced. The will crystallized this narrative into a single act, leaving no room for doubt or interpretation. What could drive a son to kill the very people who gave him life? What kind of betrayal festers quietly for decades, only to erupt in the most unimaginable violence? These are questions that haunt the story of Nick Reiner and the tragic deaths of his parents, Rob and Michelle Reiner. On a serene Sunday morning in Brentwood, a neighborhood synonymous with wealth, privilege, and Hollywood glamour, the Reiner estate became the scene of a horrifying crime. The grandeur of the $13.5 million mansion stood in stark contrast to the carnage inside, where Rob, 78, and Michelle, 70, were found stabbed to death in their own home. The discovery was made by their daughter, Romy, 27, a moment that would scar her forever and which immediately turned a private family tragedy into a public spectacle. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. The story that unfolded over the next hours, days, and weeks shocked not just Los Angeles but the entire world. The name Reiner had long been associated with Hollywood royalty, famed directors, celebrated actors, a family who seemed to embody success, sophistication, and charm. Yet behind the carefully curated public image, a darker reality had been simmering. Nick Reiner, their 32-year-old son, lived in the guest house on the property, and he became the focus of an investigation that would reveal disturbing secrets about loyalty, resentment, and a perceived erasure that would ultimately erupt in violence. What motivated him to allegedly commit such a heinous act? The answer, according to Nick, lies in something as mundane, yet as profoundly triggering, as a change in a family will. Just 3 days before his parents' deaths, Nick claims, Rob and Michelle updated their estate plans, removing him completely from the will. Everything, every asset, every piece of wealth, every symbol of familial inheritance, was redirected to his sisters, Romy and Tracy. To some, this might seem like a minor administrative decision. To Nick, it was catastrophic. He describes feeling erased from the family. A son who had been loyal for decades suddenly stripped of recognition, of belonging, of even the faint acknowledgement that he was part of his parents' legacy. The psychological impact of being cut out of a family will is profound in any context, but in a household like the Reiners, where public image and private wealth intersect, the blow was magnified. Imagine waking up one day to discover that, in the eyes of your parents, your place in the family had been nullified. Imagine the confusion, the rage, the desperation. This was not a story of sudden madness and isolation. It was a story of perceived betrayal, of long-standing grievances, of emotional wounds that had been ignored or overlooked. Family psychologists often cite inheritance disputes as one of the most potent triggers for adult familial conflict. But even within that framework, few could have predicted that this particular rift would escalate to murder. The timeline is both chilling and precise. On Sunday, December 14th, law enforcement received reports from Romy, who had discovered the bodies. She mentioned a dangerous family member, who should be considered a suspect, immediately drawing suspicion toward Nick. Police reports described the cause of death as multiple sharp force injuries, a violent, deliberate act. It was clear that the crime was not accidental, and the manner of death was officially ruled as homicide. Within hours, Nick was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The legal process had begun, but the story that would grip the public extended far beyond courtroom proceedings. What makes this case so compelling, so horrifying, is the intersection of fame, wealth, and family dysfunction. The Reiners were not just any family, they were a Hollywood dynasty. Rob Reiner, renowned for his contributions to film, had spent decades building an empire, both professionally and personally. Michelle, too, was a central figure in maintaining the family's public persona, the matriarch whose influence was both stabilizing and controlling. The narrative that Nick presents, that of a son betrayed by his own parents, challenges the image of familial harmony that the world had long believed in. It asks uncomfortable questions about loyalty, love, and the human capacity for anger when one feels unjustly excluded. The public reaction has been a mixture of shock, disbelief, and morbid curiosity. How could a son, raised in privilege and comfort, reach a point of lethal rage against his own parents? What were the warning signs? Friends, neighbors, and insiders have painted a picture of a family that, while outwardly perfect, was fraught with tension and unspoken grievances. The Reiners' wealth and fame only amplified the stakes, turning private family conflicts into matters of public fascination. Social media exploded with speculation, rumor, and analysis, often blurring the line between fact and conjecture. Every detail, every revelation about the will, every eyewitness account was dissected and debated. But the heart of the story is deeper than gossip. It is about a son who felt abandoned, erased, and wronged. It is about parents whose choices, intended or not, became the catalyst for tragedy. And it is about a family that, in the span of hours, went from a Hollywood dream to a headline of horror. The narrative we are about to explore is multi-layered. It involves legal intricacies, psychological insights, familial dynamics, and the chilling reality of what can happen when betrayal, perceived or real, meets opportunity and anger. As we peel back the layers of this story, it's important to remember that the public narrative is only part of the truth. Nick's account provides insight into his perspective, but it raises as many questions as it answers. How long had he been harboring resentment? Were there prior incidents that escalated tensions? How did the relationships between him, his parents, and his sisters evolve over time? These are not simple questions, and their answers will challenge your assumptions about loyalty, justice, and family. Consider for a moment the psychological impact of exclusion from a will. It is not just about money. It is about recognition, validation, and belonging. In some families, inheritance disputes remain theoretical, arguments fought in courtrooms or over dinners. In others, the perceived slight festers into a sense of existential threat. For Nick, the will represented a symbolic erasure, a final rejection that negated years of loyalty. And in that perception, the seed of the tragedy was planted. Yet, even as we explore Nick's motive, it is impossible to ignore the human dimension of the story. Romy and Tracy are left grappling with loss, trauma, and the shocking reality that their brother, whom they grew up with, may have been the instrument of their parents' deaths. Their perspective, the emotional weight they carry, and the decisions they make in the aftermath will form a critical part of the story. The narrative is not only about crime. It is about grief, betrayal, and the ripples of trauma that extend far beyond the immediate act. What makes this case particularly haunting is the proximity of living spaces. Nick resided in the guest house on the Reiner estate, mere steps from his parents. Physical proximity combined with emotional distance created a volatile situation. Every detail of the estate, every interaction, and every overlooked signal becomes significant in understanding how this tragedy unfolded. The opulence of the property, with its sprawling gardens, luxury amenities, and isolation from neighbors, offered both a sanctuary and a trap, a stage for a crime that would stun the world. And then there is the matter of timing. The precise moment when the will was updated, just 72 hours before the murders, adds a layer of dramatic tension that cannot be overstated. It suggests a sudden trigger, a final straw in a complex web of grievances. But timing alone does not tell the full story. We must examine years of history, the relationships within the family, and the ways in which resentment, perceived injustice, and opportunity intersected to produce a lethal outcome. As we prepare to delve into the chapters ahead, ask yourself, what drives a person to commit the ultimate betrayal? Is it anger, greed, desperation, or something deeper, rooted in long-term psychological wounds? How much responsibility lies with the individual, and how much with the family dynamics that created the conditions for tragedy? These questions will guide our exploration, chapter by chapter, as we uncover the shocking, heartbreaking, and complex reality of the Reiner family story. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. What do you see when you look at the Reiner family? Do you see Hollywood royalty, an unshakable dynasty of success, charm, and talent? Or do you see the cracks, the hidden tensions, the unspoken resentments that fester behind the glamorous smiles and perfectly staged family photos? The story of Rob Reiner, Michelle Reiner, and their son Nick is not just a tale of wealth and fame. It is a cautionary narrative about appearances, perception, and the dangerous gap that can exist between what the world sees and what really happens behind closed doors. To the public, the Reiners were the definition of achievement. Rob Reiner had spent decades building his reputation as a legendary director and actor, creating films that became cultural landmarks. Michelle Reiner maintained a presence that radiated grace and social sophistication, ensuring the family's image was spotless. Romy and Tracy, the daughters, were often seen in the background of photos at premieres, charity events, and family gatherings, appearing the picture-perfect Hollywood siblings. Nick, meanwhile, lived in the shadow of all this, in the guest house of the sprawling Brentwood estate. But image can be deceiving. Beneath the surface of every smiling photograph and carefully curated social media post, tensions simmered. The Reiners were no exception. Families, especially those in the public eye, often struggle with the dual pressures of maintaining appearances while managing private discord. It is in this dissonance that many tragedies quietly take root. In the Reiners' case, there were signs of strain that the public never saw. Arguments hushed before the cameras, subtle expressions of favoritism, and the slow build-up of feelings of exclusion. Consider Nick's position within this family. Living in the guest house, he had proximity without access. He was part of the family in name, yet physically separated from the heart of daily life. In some families, a living arrangement like this is benign, even practical. But for Nick, it became a symbol of his perceived marginalization. Each shared meal he missed, each event he was not part of, each decision made without his input fed into a growing sense of being sidelined, overlooked, and ultimately erased. The public rarely glimpses this side of fame. Hollywood families are often idealized, their conflicts sanitized or completely hidden from view. Yet the dynamics at play in the Reiner household were familiar in their complexity: parental favoritism, sibling rivalry, and the unspoken hierarchies that determine who is in and who is out. According to insiders, Nick had always been the quieter one, the son whose loyalty was assumed but whose voice was seldom heard. Romy and Tracy, by contrast, were seen as the front-facing family members, often celebrated for their charm, accomplishments, or simply their presence at high-profile events. It is easy to underestimate the emotional consequences of this kind of exclusion. Psychologists note that feeling invisible within a family, especially one that is wealthy and influential, can create profound feelings of inadequacy and resentment. In Nick's case, these feelings were compounded by the public success of his siblings. Each achievement by Romy or Tracy was a reminder of his own perceived failure to claim his place, to be recognized, to matter. Over time, these small emotional wounds can calcify, forming a sense of injustice that becomes difficult to reconcile. Adding fuel to the fire was the recent revelation about the family will. While the details would only come to light in the aftermath of the murders, the psychological impact on Nick cannot be overstated. Being cut out of the will entirely, while his sisters inherited the full estate, transformed a simmering resentment into a perception of absolute betrayal. What had once been emotional neglect or familial distance now had tangible consequences. Erasure from his parents' legacy, removal from their financial plans, and the implication that he was, in a sense, unwanted. But the Reiners' image of perfection was still firmly in place, at least publicly. Friends, colleagues, and acquaintances spoke of the family with admiration, highlighting Rob's legendary career, Michelle's elegance and social influence, and the children's poised appearances. There were parties, charity galas, and photo ops, all reinforcing the notion of a harmonious family. Yet, beneath the velvet rope of public perception, private frustrations and quiet animosities persisted. This duality, public perfection and private dysfunction, is crucial to understanding the events that followed. Families everywhere experience conflict, but when resentment is coupled with opportunity, proximity, and sudden provocation, the stage is set for tragedy. In the Reiner household, Nick's feelings of exclusion, compounded by years of perceived favoritism, and culminating in the shocking revelation of his removal from the will, created a perfect storm. It is also important to note the role of perception in this story. Nick's sense of erasure may have been amplified by his own experiences and interpretations, but for him, the emotional reality was real and immediate. His parents' actions, however mundane or legally routine, were seen as a declaration of rejection, a final confirmation that he no longer belonged. To a son who had spent decades loyal to his family, this was not merely disappointing, it was existentially threatening. As we explore this story, it becomes clear that the Reiner's tragedy is not just about wealth or inheritance. It is about the deep, often hidden currents of family dynamics. The quiet resentments that build over years, the ways in which favoritism and exclusion can warp relationships, and the catastrophic potential of a single act perceived as betrayal. Every decision, every interaction, every choice of attention or neglect contributes to the emotional landscape in which this drama unfolded. And yet, the public narrative would only scratch the surface. Initial reports focused on the shocking violence, the arrests, and the sensational aspects of a Hollywood family torn apart. But to understand why this happened, to grasp the human element behind the headlines, we must look deeper. We must examine the lives, the personalities, and the interactions that created a situation where tragedy was not only possible, but, in some ways, predictable. The Reiner story is a stark reminder that image and reality are rarely aligned. The carefully staged photographs, the social appearances, and the veneer of glamour concealed tensions that were both subtle and powerful. Nick's isolation, both physical and emotional, his perception of favoritism, and the sudden, crushing blow of being cut out of the will, all converged to create a scenario in which grief, rage, and betrayal collided. As the investigation unfolded, the contrast between public perception and private reality became more pronounced. Friends and neighbors were shocked, struggling to reconcile the loving, sophisticated family they knew with the brutal events that had occurred. Every detail that emerged, from the layout of the estate to the timing of the will, added layers of complexity and horror. By the time law enforcement arrived at the Brentwood estate, the Reiners' public image as a perfect family had been irrevocably shattered. What had seemed like a story of success and familial harmony was now revealed to be a narrative of tension, exclusion, and simmering resentment, a narrative that culminated in one of the most shocking events in recent Hollywood history. But even as we peel back these layers, one question remains. How could feelings of exclusion and betrayal escalate into the kind of lethal violence that ended Rob and Michelle Reiner's lives? What was it about the family dynamic, the history of interactions, and the final act of erasure that triggered such a catastrophic response? The answers lie ahead, as we explore each chapter of this story in detail, uncovering the hidden tensions, the psychological triggers, and the sequence of events that led to an unimaginable tragedy. Every layer we uncover will reveal more about how a family that appeared so perfect could harbor the seeds of its own destruction. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Imagine growing up in the shadow of fame and expectation. Imagine living in a house where the walls seem to echo with accolades, awards, and the footsteps of a family that the world admires, while you feel increasingly invisible. This was the world of Nick Reiner, the only son of Rob and Michelle Reiner. From an early age, he occupied a peculiar space in his family. A son surrounded by love and opportunity, yet constantly grappling with a sense of being overlooked. Nick was born into a household that many would envy. Rob Reiner had already established himself as a respected director and actor, a figure whose work shaped generations of cinema. Michelle, intelligent and socially astute, cultivated a family environment that blended sophistication with cultural awareness. On paper, Nick's childhood had everything: financial security, access to elite education, and the social networks that could open doors to Hollywood and beyond. But what Nick inherited in dollars and status, he struggled to claim in attention and acknowledgement. The early years of any child's life are shaped by the way they are seen and valued by their parents. For Nick, there were moments of genuine warmth, affection, and engagement. Yet, alongside these moments, there were persistent feelings of being sidelined. Family accounts suggest that while Romy and Tracy were often encouraged, celebrated, and positioned at the center of family activities, Nick's presence was sometimes taken for granted. He was the quieter child, the one whose successes were assumed and whose missteps were amplified. Picture a family dinner in the Reiner household. The camera flash of public attention might be absent, but the psychological spotlight was always present. Romy and Tracy would receive praise for grades, performances, or social charm, while Nick's achievements were quietly noted, often without fanfare. Over time, these small patterns of recognition, or lack thereof, can compound, fostering a sense of inadequacy and invisibility. Nick's perception of being the forgotten son wasn't simply about ego, it was about identity. It was about whether he mattered in the family narrative. At the same time, the existence of the will created a paradox. The sisters, beneficiaries of the document, were positioned in a way that simultaneously affirmed their value and highlighted Nick's exclusion. This dynamic is common in families with inheritance disputes. Those who benefit are often caught between relief and guilt, while those excluded experience a sense of existential rejection. For Nick, the emotional weight of this exclusion was magnified by his proximity to the estate, by the immediacy of living within sight of what he had lost, and by the perceived permanence of the decision. The will also represents a fascinating intersection of psychology and opportunity. In ordinary circumstances, a legal change like this might provoke anger, legal challenges, or emotional estrangement, but rarely does it trigger violence. Yet in Nick's case, the convergence of long-standing resentment, perceived injustice, and immediate access to the family's private spaces created a unique and dangerous situation. It illustrates how powerful perceived betrayal can become when combined with access and emotional intensity. Consider the psychological mechanics at play. Humans are wired to respond to social exclusion with strong emotional reactions. Being removed from a will, especially in a context where one has been loyal, engaged, and invested, can feel like an existential threat. It challenges the very foundation of one's identity and role within the family unit. For Nick, the document was not just paper. It was a judgment, a verdict, and, in his mind, a provocation. Friends and insiders noted that Nick had long struggled with feelings of being undervalued. He had attempted to maintain connections, to participate in family life, and to assert his presence in ways that were often subtle. Yet these efforts were met with inconsistent recognition. The will, then, was the culmination of years of perceived neglect. It was a tangible, undeniable act that confirmed everything he feared. He was no longer part of the family he had always served. Interestingly, the timing of the will's change adds another layer of tension. Why update it just days before a tragic event? Whether coincidental or intentional, the result was catastrophic. Legal experts note that sudden updates can create emotional turbulence in any family, but when combined with existing psychological vulnerabilities, the impact can be profound. For Nick, the convergence of timing, perceived betrayal, and lifelong frustration was enough to tip the balance toward catastrophic action. Yet, even as we examine the will as a catalyst, it is important to remember that this was only one part of a broader emotional landscape. Nick's feelings of exclusion were reinforced by daily interactions, by years of subtle favoritism toward his sisters, and by a lifetime of perceived marginalization. The documents served as the final straw, but the foundation had been laid over decades. The will did not create the anger. It crystallized it, giving it a focus, a justification, and, tragically, an opportunity. It is also worth noting that the sisters' awareness of the will and its implications may have unknowingly contributed to the tension. While they were beneficiaries, they also carried the weight of knowing that their brother felt wronged. In families, the interplay of perceived favoritism and tangible benefits can create invisible pressures. Romy and Tracy were suddenly placed in a morally complex position. They had gained materially, yet the emotional consequences for their brother were devastating. This duality adds depth to the tragedy, showing how inheritance disputes can ripple through family systems in unpredictable ways. The will's impact was not just emotional, it was structural. It altered relationships, redefined family hierarchies, and created a sense of irreversibility. Nick reportedly felt that there was no path back, no way to reconcile, no opportunity to regain recognition. In his mind, the document erased decades of loyalty, love, and contribution. It became not just a legal instrument, but a symbol of rejection, an emblem of familial failure. The combination of emotional intensity, perceived betrayal, and proximity to opportunity created a dangerous alignment of factors. Psychologists often refer to this as a convergence of risk factors: long-standing grievances, sudden triggers, perceived injustice, and immediate access to targets. In Nick's case, these risk factors collided in the most catastrophic way imaginable, transforming a legal and emotional slight into a deadly confrontation. As we explore the events that followed, it becomes clear that the updated will was more than a catalyst. It was a flashpoint, a moment where all the accumulated tension of a lifetime could, and tragically did, erupt. The Reiner family, outwardly perfect and admired, was facing the collapse of its internal dynamics in real time, a collapse that would culminate in the deaths of Rob and Michelle Reiner. And yet, even with this context, there were still layers of complexity, of hidden motives, and of interpersonal dynamics that no one fully understood. The will set the stage, but the next chapter, examining the estate itself, the physical spaces where these tensions played out, and the environment that made such a tragedy possible, reveals just how precarious the situation had become. But what came next would turn the family home, a place of memories, laughter, and childhood experiences, into a scene of unimaginable horror, and no one could have predicted the storm that was about to break. The Reiner estate was more than just a house. It was a symbol of status, success, and the Hollywood dream realized. Sitting on sprawling acres in Brentwood, Los Angeles, the $13.5 million property exuded opulence, manicured lawns, high walls for privacy, and a design that married luxury with comfort. Yet beneath the aesthetic perfection, the estate itself became a character in the story, a stage where private tensions, family conflicts, and, ultimately, tragedy would unfold. From the outside, the estate was the picture of idyllic wealth. Tall gates shielded it from public view, offering privacy that most could only imagine. Inside, the main house was expansive, with multiple living spaces, elaborate furnishings, and the quiet hum of a family accustomed to comfort and security. The daughters, Romy and Tracy, inhabited spaces close to the central heart of the household, enjoying the privileges of both physical proximity and emotional access. Nick, by contrast, resided in the guest house, a separate structure on the same grounds. Though luxurious in its own right, the guest house symbolized distance, both literal and metaphorical. It offered proximity to family, while simultaneously isolating him from the daily rhythms and decision-making of the household. Every estate has its rhythms, routines, and hidden corners. In a family like the Reiners, these physical spaces were entwined with emotional spaces. The main house represented recognition, inclusion, and centrality. The guest house represented observation, exclusion, and, for Nick, resentment. Living mere yards from his parents, yet separated by walls and doors, he experienced both closeness and alienation. Every interaction, every dinner invitation, every family gathering, every whispered conversation was filtered through this lens. The estate, in effect, became a silent witness to his feelings of marginalization. The design of the property also amplified the drama. Expansive gardens, private walkways, and secluded corners created opportunities for both reflection and confrontation. In many ways, the estate was a double-edged sword. It offered security, but it also provided isolation. For Nick, this isolation was critical. It allowed for private rumination, the building of resentment, and, tragically, unmonitored access to the family he felt had rejected him. Every space on the property, from the guest house to the main entrance, became part of the psychological landscape of the tragedy. Security and privacy, hallmarks of a celebrity home, also played a role in the events that unfolded. The estate's gates, walls, and seclusion meant that disturbances were unlikely to be noticed immediately. Neighbors, though nearby, were shielded from the day-to-day dynamics. In a sense, the very features that were intended to protect and preserve the family's lifestyle also made the estate a closed environment where conflict could escalate unchecked. Inside the home, the layout of rooms, hallways, and communal areas mirrored family dynamics. The daughters' bedrooms and shared spaces were close to the heart of the household, where interactions and parental attention were concentrated. Nick's separation in the guest house reinforced his sense of exclusion. Meals, casual conversations, and moments of warmth occurred without him or with him as a peripheral presence. Each physical separation mirrored an emotional one, reinforcing long-standing perceptions of being undervalued and overlooked. Beyond architecture, the estate carried memories, both joyful and tense. Birthdays, holidays, celebrations, and everyday routines unfolded within these walls. Each corner of the property was imbued with emotional resonance, from laughter in the dining room to whispered disagreements in private chambers. For Nick, these memories were layered with both affection and frustration, love intertwined with exclusion, happiness with resentment. The physical space of the estate, in this way, became inseparable from the emotional history that would culminate in tragedy. The Brentwood estate was also a symbol of legacy. Every feature, the art on the walls, the design of the gardens, the investment in comfort and privacy, represented decades of success and familial pride. The will, recently updated, shifted the symbolic inheritance within these very walls. Nick's exclusion was not just from money but from the tangible legacy embedded in every corner of the estate. The spaces he lived near, the furniture he saw daily, and the artifacts of his parents' lives became constant reminders of his perceived erasure. As the day of the tragedy approached, these factors coalesced. The estate's physical layout, combined with emotional tension and recent revelations, created a volatile environment. Living within sight of what he felt he had lost, Nick experienced proximity as provocation. The beauty of the property, the luxury that outsiders envied, and the familial spaces that were his to observe but not fully inhabit, all contributed to the psychological pressure building within him. Even the mundane aspects of estate life, security cameras, multiple entrances, quiet hallways, became part of the narrative. Each feature influenced movement, opportunities for interaction, and moments of solitude. The estate was both sanctuary and trap, offering comfort while isolating its residents in ways that intensified emotional strain. The walls that were meant to protect the family ultimately bore witness to a breakdown that no one could have anticipated. In understanding the tragedy, it is essential to see the estate not just as a backdrop, but as a participant in the story. Its design, spaces, and separations mirrored the family's emotional landscape, creating a physical environment where conflict, resentment, and opportunity intersected. The guest house, the main living areas, the gardens, all were stages on which decades of tension would play out in the most devastating way imaginable. The Brentwood estate also highlights the contrast between public perception and private reality. From the street, it appeared serene, luxurious, and controlled. Inside, however, the tensions of family dynamics, sibling rivalry, and perceived exclusion simmered unseen. The opulence masked conflict, and the privacy that ensured safety also delayed intervention. The estate, in its grandeur, became a crucible for psychological pressure, a place where personal grievances could escalate without oversight. And then came the day when the estate, a symbol of success and comfort, became a crime scene. The very spaces that had nurtured family life, dining rooms, hallways, gardens, witnessed horror. The beauty and luxury of the property contrasted starkly with the brutality that unfolded, amplifying the shock and disbelief that reverberated through the Reiner family and the public at large. The estate teaches a chilling lesson. Even spaces designed for security, comfort, and family cohesion can become theaters for tragedy when emotional, psychological, and situational factors align. For Nick, the proximity, the physical separation, and the visual reminders of what he had lost converged to create conditions that would culminate in murder. And yet, even with all this context, the immediate events of December 14th remain almost unimaginable. The precise timing, the sequence of actions, and the decisions made within this sprawling, luxurious estate set the stage for a tragedy that shocked the world. But what came next? The fateful day itself. would turn this estate from a place of memories and family life into the epicenter of a crime so brutal that it left no part of the family untouched. Sunday, December 14th, began like any other day at the Reiner estate, or at least it appeared that way from the outside. The sun rose over Brentwood, casting golden light on the manicured lawns of the sprawling $13.5 million property. Birds chirped, doors clicked open, and the family's daily rhythms commenced as if life itself had not been hiding the storm brewing beneath the surface. But for Nick Reiner, the day carried a weight unlike any he had ever felt. It was the day when decades of resentment, frustration, and perceived betrayal collided with the tangible reality of the updated will, creating a perfect storm that would end in tragedy. The morning began quietly. Nick, living in the guest house, went about his routine, surrounded by luxury, yet isolated by walls that had come to symbolize emotional distance. Inside the main house, Rob and Michelle were going about their day, seemingly unaware of the intensity of the storm that had been quietly building within their son. Romy and Tracy may have sensed tension, but like most family members accustomed to navigating complex dynamics, the signs could easily be misread or dismissed. The catalyst of the day was the updated will. According to Nick's account, the knowledge that he had been erased from the estate had hit him hard. It was not a distant grievance anymore. It was immediate, real, and tangible. For years, he had internalized feelings of marginalization, comparing himself to his sisters and questioning his role in the family. Now, with a single legal document, his worst fears were confirmed. His loyalty, love, and presence had been deemed insufficient. The will became a mirror, reflecting not only his exclusion but also the weight of his lifetime of perceived neglect. As the morning progressed, tensions intensified. Nick reportedly wrestled with emotions he could no longer contain. Anger, despair, and a sense of injustice boiled beneath the surface. In most families, these feelings might be expressed in arguments, silent withdrawals, or estrangement. But the alignment of circumstance, access, and psychological pressure created a dangerous environment. The estate, with its proximity and privacy, offered both temptation and opportunity, while Nick's internal state acted as the spark. The details of the timeline that day are critical. Investigators later determined that the murders occurred inside the main house, where Rob and Michelle were found with multiple sharp force injuries. Each injury, each wound, reflected a level of violence that spoke to both anger and intent. It was not a moment of blind panic. It was deliberate, sustained, and horrifying. The precision and ferocity of the attack suggest a culmination of deeply held grievances, brought to a breaking point by the events of the previous days and the perceived betrayal of the will. Romy, who would later discover the bodies, was not present during the initial confrontation, yet her presence on the estate highlights the emotional and logistical complexity of the day. She had been navigating her own routine, likely unaware of the immediate danger, when she stumbled upon a scene that would alter her life forever. Her shock, horror, and immediate recognition of potential danger underscore the rapid escalation from family tension to lethal violence. Psychologically, the events of December 14th illustrate the convergence of motive, opportunity, and environment. Nick had motive in the form of perceived exclusion and betrayal, opportunity due to his proximity within the estate, an environment shaped by years of isolation, frustration, and unaddressed emotional wounds. Together, these factors created a scenario in which violence became a tragically predictable outcome. Friends and neighbors later described the estate as unusually quiet that Sunday, a silence that belied the chaos erupting within. The contrast between the serene exterior and the violent interior echoes the broader theme of the Reiner family story: appearances versus reality. From the outside, nothing seemed amiss. Inside, decades of tension, subtle slights, and the immediate provocation of the will converged in the most catastrophic way imaginable. The aftermath of the initial act unfolded rapidly. Once Romy discovered the bodies, law enforcement was called. She provided crucial information about a dangerous family member, immediately directing suspicion toward Nick. Her description highlights both her understanding of family dynamics and the urgency of the situation. The discovery, in the hands of law enforcement, transformed a private tragedy into a public crime scene, and the Reiner estate became the focus of national attention. Investigators noted the precision and violence of the attack, identifying multiple sharp force injuries consistent with first-degree homicide. The scene suggested not only intent, but also deep emotional involvement, an escalation beyond what might be expected from a momentary loss of control. The fact that Nick had been living on the property meant he had immediate access, turning a private grievance into a deadly confrontation within hours. The timing of the will's revelation, just 72 hours prior, underscores the immediacy of the trigger. Long-standing resentment had been brewing for years, but this legal act crystallized the grievance into perceived injustice. It was a moment where psychological, environmental, and emotional factors converged, transforming latent anger into lethal action. For investigators, understanding the motivations behind the act required examining decades of family history, patterns of exclusion, and the immediate provocation of the will. The events of December 14th also raised profound questions about family dynamics, mental health, and the consequences of unaddressed grievances. Nick's actions, while shocking and tragic, were not random. They were the culmination of years of perceived neglect, frustration, and marginalization. The Reiner estate, with its physical separation of living spaces and isolation from outside oversight, provided a setting where these emotions could manifest without interruption. And yet, even amidst the horror, the day did not end there. The arrival of law enforcement, the involvement of Romy in identifying potential suspects, and the arrest of Nick transformed the situation from a private family crisis into a national news story. The Reiners, once emblematic of Hollywood success and familial cohesion, were now at the center of a narrative of betrayal, murder, and public scrutiny.